You are standing in a busy Egyptian market, and the smell hits you first. Fresh fish laid out on wet reeds, bread still warm from the oven, onions, garlic, piles of figs and dates going soft in the heat. A goose hangs by its feet at one stall, a duck at the next. There is meat here, there is plenty of it, and your stomach growls. But look closely at everything on offer. Walk the whole length of that market, past every stall and every basket, and you will not find one single thing that we would recognize as the most ordinary meat in the world today. There is no chicken, not a leg, not a wing, not an egg. Nowhere. In a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, that fed millions of people, that wrote down and painted and carved almost everything they ate, the one bird that now feeds the entire planet is almost completely missing. And that is genuinely strange, because today chicken is everywhere. It is the default meat of the human race. So the question is simple, and the answer is stranger than you'd think. Why did the ancient Egyptians almost never eat chicken? Stay with me, because the real reason has nothing to do with taste, and everything to do with a bird that came from the other side of the world. Let's clear up the obvious answer first, because most people guess it and most people are wrong. You might assume the Egyptians didn't eat chicken because of some religious rule, some sacred law that made the bird forbidden, the way certain animals are off limits in certain cultures. That's a reasonable guess. It's also not the reason. The real reason is much simpler and much stranger. The Egyptians didn't eat chicken for most of their history for one very good reason. There were no chickens. Not there, not yet. For almost the entire span of the great Egyptian civilization, the one you picture when you think of pyramids and pharaohs and golden masks, the chicken simply did not exist in Egypt. It hadn't arrived, it was still thousands of miles away, living wild in a completely different part of the world, and it would take an astonishingly long time to make the journey. To understand why there was no chicken on that market stall, you have to understand where chickens actually come from, and the answer is nowhere near Egypt. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone. The chicken is not originally a farm animal at all. It is a jungle bird, the ancestor of every single chicken alive today, all 20-something billion of them, is a shy, colorful, flighty creature called the red jungle fowl, and it lived deep in the forests of South and Southeast Asia. Picture dense green jungle, thick heat, tangled trees, thousands of miles east of Egypt across mountains and deserts and seas. That is the chicken's true homeland. This bird was never wandering the banks of the Nile. It was hiding in the undergrowth of tropical forests on the far side of the continent, roosting in trees, darting away from anything that moved. And somewhere in that region, thousands of years ago, humans began the slow process of taming it. But here is the part that reframes the whole story. When people first tamed the jungle fowl, they almost certainly were not doing it for food. And once you understand what they were doing it for instead, the whole picture changes. Because the first chickens were not dinner, they were something much more exciting. Think about what a wild jungle fowl actually is. The males are stunning, with glossy feathers and bright red combs, and they are aggressive. Two males will fight each other fiercely, and they will do it to the death if allowed. And that, not the meat, not the eggs, is very likely what first drew humans to this bird. The rooster was a fighter. Cockfighting, as brutal as it sounds to us, was one of the oldest and most widespread entertainments in the ancient world, and a good fighting bird was valuable, prized, even admired. So the earliest relationship between humans and chickens was not a farmer feeding a flock, it was something closer to owning a champion. These birds were kept for sport, for status, for spectacle. They were rare and special, and you did not eat a rare and special thing. You showed it off. Eating your prize-fighting bird would have been like melting down a trophy to make soup. The chicken began its journey with humans not as food, but as a living symbol of power and excitement, and that reputation clung to it for a very long time. And there was more to it than fighting, because this bird did something that genuinely amazed ancient people. The rooster crows at dawn. Every single morning, reliably, before the sun is even up, the rooster lifts its head and calls, and the light comes. To us, that is background noise. An alarm clock we can silence. But put yourself in the mind of a person thousands of years ago, in a world with no clocks, no way to measure time in the dark, no certainty that the sun would return at all. And here is this bird that seems to summon the sun, that announces the defeat of the terrifying night. That calls the light back into the world, on time, every day, without fail. To ancient people, that was not ordinary. That was close to magic. In many early cultures, the rooster became a sacred creature, a symbol of the sun, of light conquering darkness, of protection against the evils of the night. A bird like that was not livestock. It was a small daily miracle with feathers. So the chicken traveled through the ancient world wrapped in two powerful reputations at once, the fierce champion and the herald of the sun. Neither of those is a reputation that ends with the bird on a dinner plate. So now you can see the shape of the answer forming. The chicken was born in far-off Asian jungles. It was tamed for fighting and for wonder, not for food. And it spread across the world slowly, passed from culture to culture as a marvel, a fighter, a sacred thing, long before anyone thought of it as a meal. And its journey toward Egypt was a long one. It moved westward across Asia over many centuries, through trade and conquest and the simple human habit of carrying interesting things from place to place. It reached the great civilizations of the ancient Near East. And only after a very long time, when the classic age of the pyramids was already ancient history even to the Egyptians themselves, did the chicken finally trickle into Egypt in any real numbers. Think about how staggering that gap is. The Great Pyramid was built, and stood, and grew old, and became a tourist attraction for ancient tourists, all before chicken was a normal food in Egypt. When we imagine an Egyptian pharaoh sitting down to a feast, there is no roast chicken on that table. There couldn't be. The bird simply wasn't there. And that slow journey west is worth picturing, because it wasn't a straight line and it wasn't quick. The chicken didn't march to Egypt. It drifted, over hundreds and hundreds of years, hopping from one people to the next like a rumor that takes generations to cross a continent. A trader would carry a pair of these strange fighting birds to the next town along a route. A ruler would receive a few as an exotic gift and keep them behind palace walls. A conquering army would pick them up in one land and set them down in another. Each step moved the bird a little further from its jungle home and a little closer to the Nile, but each step took time, sometimes lifetimes. It passed through the great empires and river valleys of Asia. It reached the lands of the ancient Near East, where it began to appear in art and stories, and all the while it kept its glamour, still a fighter, still a sacred bird, still something a little too special to simply cook. By the time this slow-moving marvel finally reached Egypt in real numbers, whole dynasties had risen and fallen. The bird had spent centuries as a legend before it ever had a chance to become lunch. Now here's the reframe that flips how you probably picture ancient meals. If there was no chicken, you might imagine the Egyptians had very little meat, that they lived on bread and vegetables and went without. That is completely wrong. The Egyptian table was rich, varied, and full of birds, just not that bird. What they had instead was the duck and the goose, and these two ran the show. Egypt sits on the Nile, surrounded by marshes and wetlands that were absolutely teeming with wild waterfowl. Ducks and geese were everywhere, and the Egyptians hunted them, trapped them, and eventually raised them in large numbers. Tomb paintings are full of scenes of men wading into the reeds to catch birds, of flocks of geese being counted and herded, of ducks being prepared for the table. The goose in particular was a big deal. It was food, it was offered to the gods, it appears again and again in their art and their religion. If you wanted poultry in ancient Egypt, you didn't reach for a chicken you'd never heard of. You reached for a fat Nile goose, and it was very, very good. And it wasn't only ducks and geese. The Egyptians were surrounded by an abundance most ancient peoples could only dream of, because the Nile made their land almost impossibly rich. There was fish, enormous amounts of fish, pulled from the river in nets and dried and salted and eaten by everyone from the poorest laborer to the priests in the temples. There was beef for those who could afford it, cattle being valuable and often saved for the wealthy and for religious offerings. There was pork, quietly eaten by ordinary people, whatever the fancier sources sometimes claimed. There were pigeons and other small birds, trapped and raised in numbers. There was an entire world of eggs, too, just not chicken eggs. Duck eggs, goose eggs, the eggs of wild birds gathered from the marshes. So when you strip the chicken out of the picture, you are not left with a hungry, meat-starved people. You are left with one of the best-fed civilizations of the entire ancient world, sitting beside a river that handed them food in staggering variety. The chicken wasn't missing because they went without. It was missing because they already had everything they needed, and then some. Let me give you a single real detail that makes this whole thing click, because it turns the story from an idea into a moment. Deep in the history of Egypt, long after the pyramids, there is a scrap of evidence that shows exactly how the Egyptians saw the chicken when it finally did start to appear. In the tomb of a pharaoh, an artist drew a picture of a rooster, just one, a single sketch of this unusual foreign bird, drawn with care, almost like a curiosity, like something worth recording because it was new and strange and rare. Think about what that means. In a culture that painted geese and ducks by the hundred, that carved waterfowl into every temple wall, the chicken shows up as a single novelty sketch, an exotic oddity, a thing worth drawing precisely because you almost never saw one. That lone rooster on a tomb wall tells you everything. To the Egyptians, this was not food. This was a wonder from a far-off land, the kind of thing a king might keep to show he could, the way a ruler might keep a rare animal from the edge of the known world. The most common meat on Earth today began its life in Egypt as a museum piece. And you might be wondering how we can possibly be so sure, how anyone can say with confidence that a whole civilization didn't eat a particular bird thousands of years ago. It's a fair question, and the answer is one of the quietly brilliant things about how we study the past. We know because of what the Egyptians left behind, and because of what they didn't. They were record keepers on a scale almost no ancient people matched. They painted their food onto tomb walls so the dead could enjoy it in the afterlife. They stacked real food into graves as offerings. They wrote lists of rations, counted their flocks, carved their harvests into stone. And across all of that vast, obsessive record, geese and ducks and fish and cattle appear again and again and again, in their thousands. The chicken does not. Then there are the bones. Archaeologists dig through the rubbish heaps of ancient settlements, the old kitchen waste where people threw the remains of their meals, and those heaps are a brutally honest diary of what a people actually ate. Dig through an ancient Egyptian rubbish heap from the age of the pyramids, and you find fish bones and goose bones by the mountain. You do not find chicken bones. The absence is not a guess. It is written into the ground itself. When something is truly part of a people's daily life, they leave it everywhere without meaning to, in their art, their graves, their garbage. The chicken's near-total absence from all of it is the loudest evidence of all. And then everything changed, slowly at first and then completely, and the reason is worth sitting with. What finally turned the chicken from a rare marvel into the most farmed animal in the history of the planet was not that it tasted better than a goose. It was that the chicken turned out to be, quite simply, the most convenient food animal ever discovered. Think about what this bird can do. It is small, so it doesn't need much space or food to keep. It breeds fast and lays eggs almost constantly, far more than a goose or a duck ever would. It survives almost anywhere, in hot climates and cold ones, in cities and villages and farms. It needs no river, no marsh, no special land at all. A single family in a tiny yard can keep a few chickens and get a steady supply of eggs and meat from almost nothing. Slowly, across centuries, people everywhere worked this out. The bird that had been a fighter and a sacred symbol and a royal curiosity quietly revealed itself to be the single most practical source of protein a human being could own. And once the world realized that, there was no going back. The sacred sunbird became dinner. So let's put the whole strange story back together, because it is stranger than it first sounds. The Egyptians almost never ate chicken, and the reason was not a rule and not a taboo and not a dislike. The reason was that for almost all of their history, the chicken was a jungle bird living thousands of miles away in the forests of Asia, tamed not for food, but for fighting and for wonder. A creature so admired for its courage and its power to call back the sun that eating it would have felt absurd. It traveled the world slowly, wrapped in glory, and by the time it finally reached the Nile, the Egyptians already sat beside a river so generous with fish and geese and cattle that they had no need for a strange little foreign bird. So they didn't eat it. They drew it on a wall, once, as a curiosity, and moved on. It would take the rest of human history for that curiosity to conquer the world. And here is where it comes home to you, right now, today. The next time you order a piece of fried chicken without a second thought, or crack an egg into a pan, or walk past a fridge stacked with the cheapest meat in the shop, remember what that bird used to be. Remember that it crossed a continent as a champion and a god before it ever became cheap. Remember that a pharaoh once thought a single rooster was rare enough to paint on the wall of a tomb, the way we might photograph something we may never see again. The most ordinary thing on your plate was once one of the most extraordinary creatures in the world. A fighter, a sun caller, a marvel from the far edge of the map. Nothing about it changed except us and what we decided it was for. So here's my question for you. What food do you eat today without thinking twice that might, a few thousand years from now, Tell a strange story about the whole world. Tell me in the comments. See you in the next one.